So next we have a summary of evolution through natural selection, and that is genes mutate, individuals are selected, and populations evolve such that they are better adapted to survive and reproduce under existing environmental conditions. So we're going to look next at an example with bacteria because that can be observed in real time for us. And it also has some important relationship to environmental science and human health. So first we have a group of bacteria, and among that group of bacteria we have a few individuals who already possess genetics, the genes, to be resistant to a particular antibiotic. And under normal conditions, there would be the vast majority maybe not having that particular gene and a smaller amount that do. So once these bacteria are exposed to the particular antibiotic, most of the normal bacteria will die as a result. But those that possessed the genetic resistant traits, the genes, will survive. And so now we have more of the resistant bacteria that are able to survive and therefore reproduce, and fewer of the, quote, normal bacteria. So over time, the resistant bacteria continue to multiply, and eventually all of the bacteria will be resistant in that population. And this is important in environmental science in two areas that come readily to mind. The first is antibiotics are given to chicken and fish and beef and other things that we dine upon. And these antibiotics are the same antibiotics that humans take, at least they had been historically. So when you have large amounts of these antibiotics being given to large amounts of beef and chicken, then you're going to have antibiotic resistance occur. And then the benefits of that antibiotic are then that it's now useless for humans as well. They did introduce legislation a few years ago, and most industrial food processing has gone in this direction, where the types of antibiotics that will be used on our food crops, on our animals, are different than the antibiotics that people take, so that hopefully that will not continue to be an issue. Also, you may have heard that nowadays doctors used to just give antibiotics very readily, especially to children who appeared to have some type of infection that could have been viral and not a bacterial infection. And because of that habit of overprescribing antibiotics, a number of these bacteria did eventually become resistant. And so that practice has been suspended for the most part. The third way, you may have heard of this, is MRSA, which MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So the SA in the Staph aureus in MRSA is a bacteria that's prevalent everywhere. It's on your skin, it's in your system, etc. But some of it has mutated to become resistant to antibiotics. And in that case, when a person gets an infection, they aren't able to use antibiotics to treat it, and it's simply up to the person's own immune system whether they can survive it or not. And this mutated bacteria, this methicillin-resistant bacteria, has been found all over the place now. It's in hospitals, it's in nursing homes, it's even in most NFL locker rooms, it's in gymnastics. So anytime you have, say, a cut on the skin, this bacteria can get inside of you. And it's sort of a flesh-eating bacteria. So if it's just on your skin, you might have some problems, but it's not going to kill you. But if it gets inside of you, into your organs, then it's very painful and it will destroy those tissues and the person will die from that. Okay, so that's MRSA, and another example of resistance and mutation. Okay, so for most species, we really can't just look at them in a petri dish and see how they change over time because they reproduce much more slowly. So we're going back millions and millions and millions of years. So how do we base this theory of evolution? It came basically from the study of fossils. Fossils are organisms or parts of organisms like their shells or bones that have become mineralized. So it's skeletons like dinosaur skeletons or single bones, shells, leaves, and seeds. And sometimes it's the actual mineralized remains. Sometimes it leaves an impression in rock. And I'll have several examples for you in lecture where I can show you what these impressions of fish or shells look like. The fossil record is quite incomplete. At best, 1% of all species that have existed became fossils, which were then discovered. Not every species is going to have a fossil record. So much of what we know, though it comes from fossil record, it is limited. And so now we're looking more at molecular genetics to demonstrate the changes that occurred to species over time. Okay, a couple of clarifications about natural selection. First of all, there's that saying, survival of the fittest, but that doesn't mean the strongest survives. So in the case of the early fox population, what was fit for the colder atmosphere were those foxes that possessed the characteristics that made it survive in that atmosphere, in that climate. And what was fit for the more southern traveling foxes were the ones that had characteristics that allowed them to survive in that environment. So survival of the fittest does not mean survival of the strongest. A second important point is that organisms don't develop traits just because they would be useful. So an example here is giraffes and long necks. It wasn't that the giraffe thought, oh, gee, if I just had a longer neck, let me just stretch it out here and see if I can reach some leaves on the tops of these trees here. That's not how it works. Giraffes, like humans and horses and most birds, dogs, etc., have the same number of vertebrae, 7, in their neck. So it's 7 cervical vertebrae, they're called. But there were some giraffes in the early giraffe population that had a mutation which led to each of its vertebrae in that region being thicker than before. And so over long periods of time, those giraffes with the thicker vertebrae and the longer necks were able to survive better because they were able to reach a food source that other competitors would not be able to reach. And so over extremely long periods of time, it would have allowed it to survive, but it wasn't just because it was useful. And the third point is there's no trend toward genetic perfection. Environments on Earth have changed over the years, something that we'll look at, through everything from weather and climate to movement of the continents, to volcanoes. So at any given point in time, the Earth will change, and therefore what is fittest to that particular environment would also change. So it's not a trend toward perfection. So next we're going to look at the process of extinction, which works in the opposite way to decrease biodiversity by having species become extinct. And scientists have studied the extinction rates that occur naturally over time by studying the fossil record and seeing how long a species existed and when it went extinct. But even beyond that, beyond like a background rate of extinction, there were several times when there were massive mass extinctions, when large numbers of species went extinct over a relatively short period of geological time. And that's shown in this graph here. Here we are at time 0 and going back millions of years ago, all the way to 500 million years ago, and here we have the number of genera. Species are divided or classified, and the bottom two levels are genera and species. So this is one level up from a specific species, but pretty close. Okay, so you can see right now we are at a relatively high point of biodiversity, and you would expect that would happen again over long periods of time. But as you see, there were points of time where very short period of geological time passed, but a great number of organisms became extinct. This one here is 66 million years ago, and that's the one where the dinosaurs experienced extinction rates, and other organisms as well. And it's thought that it was caused by an asteroid which struck near Mexico and put up a huge dust cloud, which then prevented photosynthesis from occurring as in both land and marine species. And then as a result, there were massive starvations and large numbers of species went extinct. Some of these others are less well known. They may have been caused by dramatic shifts in climate or asteroids and meteorites hitting the Earth, and there's a lot of these are not yet well understood. Okay. So why are we concerned here? And we're concerned because many environmental scientists and ecologists believe that we are now entering a sixth mass extinction, but that it's not being caused by a sudden shift in conditions such as volcanic activity or a meteorite hitting the Earth. It's as a result of human activity. So let's take a brief look at that. Okay, so it's really hard to get good estimates of extinction rates, and they vary widely from one published paper to another. Some of the problem in doing that is we haven't even identified all types of species, so it's hard to calculate when one does become extinct. Also, extinction rates may vary whether you're studying, let's say, a snail or a bird or a fish, a vertebrate versus an invertebrate. They may not all be occurring at the same rate. But they certainly are examples that we know just in the past century of where organisms did become extinct as a result of human activity. Okay, so let's look at some of the human-caused causes for extinction. The first one is probably the most common cause of an extinction, and that's habitat destruction or degradation. So when we chop down a rainforest or introduce a pollutant, for example, then that habitat can be destroyed, and then that species will have either an unhealthy environment, which leads to extinction, perhaps no food source or nesting site, and eventually, if that happens broadly enough, then the organism could become extinct. A second one is over-harvesting, and that's one we'll talk a lot about. All of these we're going to spend a whole week on in the future. But over-harvesting, actually, the first case of over-harvesting, they believe, happened about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And humans hunted large animals, and they worked cooperatively in groups to trap animals in a large pit and then be able to use them for food sources. And they think that that is what happened